Hey YouTube, how's it going? Rybot 9000 here. I saw this video from PBS Spacetime recently about superdeterminism and Bell's theorem, and a lot of questions about human free will seem to center around things like quantum indeterminacy and basically indeterminism, which I find peculiar because when I think of free will as though a person had an ability to, let's first define free will as the ability to make a decision independent of any kind of determining or causal factors, right? So it doesn't matter how you were brought up. It doesn't matter um, if you have a tumor in your brain. It doesn't matter if you understood all of the options available to you. It doesn't matter if you were able to self regulate in a healthy way or if you had a history of mental illness. It's presumed that somehow, in beyond that, all that, a person is able to make a free decision out of, according to the law, moral character and capacity to reason, which taken, forget the law for a second, but just the idea that we are somehow tapped into objective morality, and we are and we always have the ability to calculate all the possibilities at one time. I think is probably like that's what it seems to imply. I think that's misguided. I back when the internet, like the whole crowdsourcing thing was taking off, um, there was a lot of people saying to themselves, "Why didn't I think of that?" And the fact that we don't control what thoughts or ideas enter into our minds, uh, we might sit down and we might think about something, we might contemplate it or deliberate on it, but we're still, at the mercy of whatever comes into our heads. How many times, like I know I have, I'm sure other people have as well. I've sat down and thought, with all this new technology, there's got to be some kind of niche, there's got to be some kind of edge that I can get in on. And still, all I do is draw a blank or think of things that other people have already done. And, you know, other things like that, like, growing up, it, for me, when I grew up, I was born in 1981. So I grew up through an era where people said things like the R word frequently, and that just became part of my language, and it became a thought that entered into my head. Um, it wasn't a free thought; it was a thought that was kind of ingrained by the culture at the time. Um, until somebody had, people do have novel thoughts or piece things together, but it's usually on the fringe or the edge of what everybody's already thinking. So, for example, I did have the idea for a crowdsourced delivery application because at the time I was doing restaurant delivery, and the way we organized was just over text message. And I thought, wow, like there is an opportunity here for somebody to build an app to coordinate all this activity and to provide. We were doing it for restaurants that didn't have their own delivery staff, that couldn't afford to do that. So we just did it for a bunch of restaurants at the same time, like DoorDash or Just Eats or Uber Eats. But there was no app at the time. So I actually did some research into it, and I found out that there were delivery services like Zip or something like that. There's one called Daily Delivery that showed up on Dragon's Den or Shark Tank, one of those shows. But those were geared more towards just a general delivery, and I was thinking of focusing on the restaurant side. So I actually built an app for it with what limited resources I had. I was kind of an unseasoned programmer, and I was building on a platform that I'd never built with before. So it took me a while to get through it, but I did a business plan. I did talk to other people that I worked with in the industry that might be interested in coming on board. They showed some interest in it, but they weren't really sure about the feasibility or investment of it. But then within 4 or 5 months, we got Just Eats, we got Skip the Dishes, we got Uber Eats. All of a sudden, everybody has this idea. So, and I'm not saying that I originally had the idea. It turns out that Uber Eats and those other platforms were already kind of in the works. Just Eats existed, but they didn't do any kind of delivery. So my point is that everybody's kind of having these thoughts at the same time, and this is a recurring phenomena in plenty of fields. There's people who have similar ideas around the same time. Like, for example, um, Irving Goffman had the theory of self-presentation. He wrote the Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, which basically spawned modern social interactionism. And at the same time, this guy named Richard Burke also had or Raymond Burke, something like that, also had the idea, and they called it very similar things. Irving Goffman called it dramatism or dramaturgy, and the other one called it dramaturgy. So they were so similar, and we see that all the time. These people aren't having free thoughts; they're thoughts that are inspired by the culture, for the large part. So there's that, right? But when you do talk about physics, of course, there's the nuts and bolts of the issue in terms of whether or not there is such a thing as determinism, or rather whether there's such thing as indeterminism, because I think we all naturally accept that there's such a thing as a determinism, because that's how the world seems to work, right? I mean, if your kitchen light goes out, you start thinking, there's a problem with the light bulb filament, or maybe the power is out, or there could be something like corrosion in the switch or broken wire going from the switch to the bulb. There's deterministic reasons for why the light ever comes on to begin with, and when it doesn't come on, that's how we fix it, is by understanding the process behind it. So I think we just accept that that this is a real phenomenon. Indeterminism, quantum indeterminacy aside, my light switch always comes on, and when it doesn't, there's a reasonable reason why it doesn't come on, right? I mean, the quantum indeterminacy, whatever you think that means, doesn't affect your everyday life in the sense that things are generally orderly. And I've studied a little bit of physics. I'm not an expert on it, but I do know that there's many, many different opinions within physics as to what the nature of reality is. Einstein famously said God doesn't play dice, and it was believed that he was disproven by the Copenhagen interpretation, or by Niels Bohr and Erwin Schrödinger. But I think in hindsight, though they were not really in disagreement, just that there was some property of the universe that we ourselves could never predict. So there could be something going on there. Like, I remember Neil deGrasse Tyson saying that we don't know what causes spontaneous symmetry breaking, but something does cause it. We just don't know what it is. So even though we have these fundamental symmetries in the early universe that basically broke into an asymmetry, we don't know why that happened, but it did happen, and there is definitely a cause for it. It didn't just happen for no reason. So I should have brought up a quote here. It's by Max Planck, saying, absolute determinism is the beginning of science, because it really is. And a lot of people have struggled with this question of necessary connection between things, or between events, or between objects. David Hume famously did so. And I think some people believe that David Hume concluded that there is no objective causality between events, But I don't think that's what he was saying. I could be wrong. I think what he was saying was that there is no way for us to definitively observe or prove the existence between these connections outside of some type of statistical analysis and data gathering, and we can infer from our analysis what the causality is, but our brains just we can only see it through our rational thinking, and we don't observe it with our eyes, and we can't necessarily just poke it with a tong and see what happens. Like we have to do experimentation. We have to continuously wrestle with the connections that we think are there. But he was not saying that those connections were not there. I think he firmly believed that they were. So, some people call these like the hidden strings, right? Uh, the hidden strings that tie everything together that we can only perceive through our intellect, and that we can't perceive with any of our other senses. Um, and I think the contrary to that, if we were to get rid of that and say, okay, now we have some kind of indeterminism, I'm not sure how that equates with free will. The fact that something doesn't obey any kind of order, the fact that it pops in and out of existence spontaneously, it doesn't seem to me like a proof or even similar to what we mean by free will. One way of talking about free will is to say that it's causa sui, or self-created, that somehow the thing is able to create itself, and that's to say that the will that you have was the will that you willed, which doesn't make any sense, because you would have to be, if you were the willer of your will, you would have to have willed the will that you had before you willed. You would be stuck in an infinite regress of trying to explain how you are the willer of your own will. So I think as it goes, like this philosopher Wesley C. Salmon has a paper called Causality and Explanation, and I think it's great because he basically lays out how causality and explanation are two sides of the same coin, and that anytime you explain something, you are giving it a causal interpretation. You are basically you're borrowing from causality to explain something. So even if you said that, without free will, we couldn't have any morality, what you're really saying is that free will is a determining factor on morality. You're saying that having free will bears a necessary connection with morality. So you are borrowing from determinism to make that claim. Obviously it doesn't seem like it because so many people do that. Same with punishment, right? Well, if there was no free will, then how can we punish people? You're saying that there is a necessary connection between punishment and free will. And if you really, really think about it, the only reason that punishment makes sense as a behavioral modification, or as a deterrent, or as, to get a person to think twice about it next time, is because you think that it's going to somehow, there's some causal connection between punishment and behavior. And so you're actually undermining this concept of free will. And obviously there's the compatibilists, and a lot of people go there and they say, well, there's compatibilism, but that doesn't really fix the problem. It's just saying, hey, you can have free will and determinism. How? How can you do that? What value does it add? What explanatory power is there in saying that people have free will? How do you, like, if you take it, say I have my computer, I'm an IT technician, so I understand computers very well. There is no part of my computer that would benefit from having a quote unquote free will. That would just mess things up. It's not gonna, if my computer just spontaneously did things that it wasn't programmed to do, then it wouldn't function at all. The whole way that a computer operates is very, very delicate, right? Because you're talking about gated channels in the central processing unit that open and close on the basis of voltages sent across the circuit board, right? And then those bus channels on the circuit board provide a communication channel between the central processing unit and the RAM and the the front side bus and the L1, L2 cache on the chip, the north bus or north bridge, south bridge, the connection to the peripherals, right? This is all determinism. And if something in there just was random, indeterministic, or even self-caused, it wouldn't help at all make that thing work. It would just mess things up. And so it is with the brain too. The brain is a bunch of gated ion channels, right? There is, if you don't know biology, there's something called the Na plus K plus sodium potassium pump, right? And what happens is, I think it's potassium is drawn into the cell by a change in the membrane potential. When a nerve cell is stimulated by stimulus, like usually a neighboring nerve cell or a receptor, like a pain receptor in the skin, the chemical change in the pain receptor sends a voltage up the nerve, which, okay, if you're talking about your periphery, like you're talking about a distal region like the hand, if you had a pain in your hand, some pain receptor is sending a voltage into your spinal cord through your brachial plexus. And once it innervates your spinal cord in like the L4, L5 region, then it connects with what's called an interneuron. So it stimulates another neuron in the spinal cord, which then sends the spinal cord into the somatosensory cortex in the brain, which is then interpreted as pain, as it's there's a lot of research on this. I mean, obviously the brain is a complex thing, so we don't really understand everything, but we understand some fundamental things about consciousness and decision making when it comes to the brain. Um, the neocortex is a multi-layered neural network. We see the power of neural networks in computing and cognitive AI services. Computers are able to recognize faces. They're able to diagnose illnesses. They're able to learn all kinds of things. And they're able to make decisions on the basis of those things using a decision network, right? And, it doesn't even have to be an artificial intelligence that adapts to environmental stimulus and then makes novel decisions on the basis of some kind of weighted value system. Neural networks artificial neural networks or computer AI systems can do that, but they've also been able to, for the longest time, just use a decision matrix, just have some kind of a decision matrix predefined that causes different outcomes or different choices to be made by the computer depending on numerous conditions, right? The only difference between like the classical decision matrix and artificial intelligence or an artificial neural network is that it's continuously updating its weights and possibly forming new synapses and growing new neurons uh, to accommodate uh, learning over the original. Like a decision matrix might just be a static thing, right? Whereas the AI is able to improve over time. So there's nothing really different between artificial intelligence making a choice that we know is not free, that's based on the dynamics of artificial intelligence. It's based off the dynamics of neural networks, and human beings making decisions on the same basis, right? Like we call it an artificial neural network because it is modeled after neural networks. It's modeled after the brain. It's modeled after the cortex and how it discriminates, differentiates, and integrates information and makes decisions. So it's nothing. There's no mysterious property of free will needed to have novel decisions. There's, you know, And again, it wouldn't make any difference if free will was there other than to complicate things and make it really messy. It wouldn't. How would that even work? What value does that add to the explanation itself? But I think the problem is that people may not understand. First of all, may not understand what really the difference between determinism and free will is. Then they may not understand like that concrete definition of it as some type of causal necessity between events and something which is acausal and has no necessity. Often the concept of free will is just thought of as social obligations, right? Like you're supposed to obey the law, you didn't obey the law, therefore you're morally culpable. And that is true, you are morally culpable. But what we're talking about there is purely the causality. If I could give another example, if I could think of another example, human beings is actually a great example because we have so many things going in and only a couple things coming out. So we make decisions, we funnel causality through ourselves in a way, right? Like, we don't do it, but it happens. We're subject to so many different causal influences, but there's a limited number of actions that we can take. So we become a funnel in a way for causality. And what that means is that we are a causal point of some type. That if you were to say that out of all these things, that is the thing that caused it, and then there may be in the most recent terms, and we're not talking about all the stuff that happened before to make to result in that happening, then people are the most appropriate thing to look at, right? Like, people do things, they do make decisions on whatever basis, and then they are the cause from that point forward, right? So there's nothing wrong with saying that person caused that to happen. That if somebody committed a crime, that they caused the crime, that they did it. But we're also not ignoring the fact that they are themselves a causal system. So you can still have accountability without free will. The question is, like, for morality, the question is whether or not you feel like it's wrong. And that is somewhat of a subjective thing. It's really hard to establish an objective basis for morality. I believe you can do it, but I probably won't go into that here, but it's really hard to establish an objective morality. Mostly it's just based off of your values, what you think is proper or right, how you feel about things. And there's all kinds of people demonstrate all kinds of variability in that. And that's perhaps why we have so many social problems, so many social disagreements. But I want to show this video too, just because I think it's funny. So check it out.
What's happening?
Sunday's tequila night at Pavlov's. Every time the bell rings, you gotta take a shot.
Why?
'Cause the bell rings.
Oh, okay.
You gotta bark first. Woof.
Charlie, when my son looked at me and told me that he wanted to go home, that broke my heart.
I saw.
I mean, my kid is sick, and I can't even be with him. I'm a failure, Charlie. I'm a failure as a father. I'm a failure as a husband.
You didn't fail. First of all, that little boy loves you. And second of all, just because your wife decides she doesn't like sleeping with men, doesn't mean you failed as a husband. Though I wouldn't brag about it.
You're right. You're right. This is Judith's fault. She's the one who breached our marriage contract asunder. And I let her make decisions that should have been in my dominion.
Alan, people are gonna do whatever they're gonna do in this world. The only thing a man can control is his own actions.
So you get the point of that. It's funny because that's what people, it's almost like that. Like people believe that they are in control of their own actions, but then immediately their behavior suggests otherwise. In this case, it was something as simple as ringing a bell and having to have a shot in a bar. So I thought that was funny. Um, I guess the other thing here is that the idea of free will, like some people say that it's and it has roots in a religion. That there's God. Say Christianity, you freely choose whether or not to accept Jesus Christ as your savior. If you do, you get to go to this glorious place called heaven after you die. And if you don't, then you have to go to hell. And to many people who are atheists, I used to identify as atheist, and I don't identify as anything anymore. Um, but that's what I would have said at the time too. Is that this is an absurd idea. How could God be good if he did this to people? And it's such a trivial thing to just believe or not believe, right? But I have to say, from studying religion in depth, and not just Christianity, but studying Christianity in depth, I don't actually see that. If I forget what everybody else thinks, if I just look at it objectively myself and I don't think about what everybody else says, it doesn't matter if, 7 billion people in the world said that's what it means. I don't see that when I read the Bible. I don't see that when I read a lot of theologians, and it also just doesn't make any sense to me. But say, for example, I've mentioned this recently in this chat that sparked this video, that in Romans 9 it says that God afore prepares some vessels unto honor and some unto dishonor, and basically it's not of human will but of God that shows mercy. So you can go into a deep analysis of it, but that seems pretty clear right there that according to Romans 9 in the biblical canon, that people don't have free will. And moreover, actually, if you want to get into it, people don't have individuality, because one implication of determinism is that everything is basically connected together by causal necessity, and therefore belongs to one system, one deterministic system. So there is no separation except the visual boundaries of things as they are perceived through our brains. But that's not to say that, if we didn't have a brain, that we would see it that way. I mean, probably wouldn't see anything at all, but our brain does something to differentiate and perceive physical boundaries, and then it's only able to perceive causality as some type of rational process. So what I actually see in religions, Christianity being one of them, is this appeal to understanding, this appeal to logic. In John 1:1, it says, "In the beginning was the Logos," which is the Greek word for logic or reason. And I've also seen the Pope Benedict XVI in this Palm Sunday saying that Christ means creative reason, and that Christians should understand that Christianity is a rational religion. This is coming from the Pope of the Catholic Church. So again, it's peppered all over the Bible as well. There's a portion in there, I think it's in Corinthians somewhere, or Ephesians, where it talks about the works in terms of speaking in tongues and going to church and singing hymns and things like that. And it talks about the importance of each one. And it places priestly study or contemplative prayer, thinking, and reasoning above all of these acts of devotion. And I think, if you take that seriously, if you take that appeal to understanding seriously, these other things like singing hymns and stuff don't seem all that important really at all. I mean, if they help people to, it's kind of like a pump, right? A primer to think and feel in a certain way, but it's not stable, it's not substantiated by any kind of understanding. Instead, when you actually do have understanding, then you naturally feel that way, and you don't need to um, prime it or influence yourself through some type of feedback, like singing a hymn, in order to feel the right way. You simply feel that way because you understand the reasons for it, and you've cleansed yourself of the habits and stuff that don't lend themselves to that. So that's the other thing, is that it's a process of self-discovery, and it's a process of learning, of becoming wiser, and of growing more stoic in a way, more self-controlled, right? It's recognizing what is correct and valuable, what is incorrect and invaluable in oneself, and then seeking to overcome by reconciling your inadequacies with quote unquote God, right? With what is actually true or real. That's what I see in the scripture. It's not this goofy notion of picking a side, whether you believe or don't believe. In fact, I interpret faith as more or less having confidence in the process, believing that there is an end to it, because initially you don't know, right? You're just ignorant about the world. All you know is what society believes or what other people tell you. You only repeat the catchphrase sayings of your generation or whatever. So to break out of that, you have to enter into a process of self-discovery, a process of discovering the world. You have to break out of your habits and patterns. You have to identify the parts of yourself that are a hindrance, and in doing so, you are you're transfiguring yourself, so to speak. You're transfiguring your soul, let's say, to make it more in line with God's will, right? You're setting aside your own will for the sake of God's will, because you recognize, not because, not out of some act of devotion or anything like that. You could call it that, but let's not call it that for the sake of clarity. And instead say that you're doing it because you understand that that is the correct thing to do. So that's the way I interpret Christianity, and I realize most people probably don't interpret it that way, but I think they're wrong. I think they're really not paying attention to what's in the text, and I think they're really not paying attention to what religious teachers in the like the Catholic saints or the monks and um, the people who dedicate their lives to it are actually telling them. Instead, they're listening to what they want to hear at a local church or at one of these, mega churches where they want to take your money and promise that somehow that's going to bring you happiness. There's all kinds of people in that sphere, and I think they're just completely wrong. Instead, if you look at what people like Meister Eckhart have said, or Anthony de Mello was a Jesuit priest there that did a lot of speeches and seminars in the 1980s, I believe. And just listen to what he has to say. It's amazing. He doesn't specifically talk about free will, but it's the ideas of um, self discovery and of seeing clearly and understanding, what he calls awareness. So, apart from that, I think Soren Kierkegaard had some excellent things to say, and he understood, as did John Duns Scotus, that Christ had to be a man, that Jesus, well, not so. Let's separate Christ from Jesus, but Jesus had to be a man, because that's the only way that he could provide an example for us to follow. If Jesus had have been some kind of godlike figure, then whatever his accomplishments were would be forever beyond our human capacity. So if he was to be an example for us, then is a bad example because we're not like him. But if we are like him, if he is just a man, then he could be a great example. Kierkegaard also thought that every individual in every generation had to discover God for themselves, and that it wasn't a given, and that there was basically a lot of misinformation, misunderstanding about it. But, that's religion. There's plenty of other examples from religion I could give. There's the Bhagavad Gita. I actually have that here somewhere. I've got a whole bunch of stuff, but let's stick to the brain and physics for now. They've done some experiments on free will. Famously, Benjamin Lebet did it in the 80s, where he was able to predict a subjectively free decision by monitoring prefrontal activity in the brain using, I think he was using EEG. This experiment was improved upon by a group of Soon, Haynes, and a couple of other researchers in 2006, I believe, where they used voxel-based fMRI images to predict subjectively free decisions up to 10 seconds before the people making the decisions realized that they even made a decision. So if they were asked to choose between two items and they sat there for 10 seconds thinking about which one to choose, the researchers were able to predict it well above chance which thing they would choose based off of premotor activity in their brain. And this is not a surprise at all. There's plenty of researchers who have tried to poke holes in it, in the methodology, or in the, say, well, even Ben Lebet claimed that maybe people have a free won't. I don't know if he really believed that there was a free won't, or if he was just saying that to kind of appeal to the masses, saying, "Hey, we basically disproved free will here with neuroscience, but maybe we have a free won't if we're lucky." You know, I don't think I think he was just basically being a bit cheeky there, making a joke. I think anybody who seriously studies the brain is going to realize that people don't have free will. And another famous, Francis Crick, he was co-discoverer of the double helical structure of DNA, along with James Watson. He went on to study the subject of consciousness and will, alongside Christoph Koch, and together, I think they penned the neural correlates of consciousness before or as Crick was passing away. Francis Crick also famously had this atheist prayer that went around, but he has another book called The Astonishing Hypothesis, which is basically him coming out and saying that we are our brains, that there is nothing more to us than our brains. And it's an excellent book. I think everybody should read it. Thomas Metzinger has another excellent book called Being No One, the Self-Model Theory of Subjectivity, which talks about how the brain creates the sense of self. There's a few books on that subject which I think are great. One is Altered Egos by Todd Feinberg, which is also very good because it looks at specific cases where the process of self-construction and the process of self-maintenance go wrong. And for example, in the case of reverse intermetamorphosis, where an individual believes themselves to actually be somebody else. But there's other more kind of crude examples of self models going wrong. For example, in phantom limb pain, where a person's arm has been cut off, but they still feel as though that arm exists. There's no signal, there's no coming from a nerve, there's no nerves. That's all been removed, but somehow the brain still thinks it exists. And actually, V.S. Ramachandran was famously able to resolve this in a way by using a mirror box, so that a person was able to see a mirror image of their good arm, and that would resolve the pain, which is interesting, right? So as soon as they have the appearance of the arm actually being there, then their brain says, "Oh, I'm okay," and it doesn't feel pain anymore. But initially, when the arm is amputated, the person's brain may be tricked into thinking that there's something, that it's still there and there's something seriously wrong with it. And remember, this is nothing to do with the person's conscious experience, since they know their arm is gone. They know their arm is missing, but yet some part of their brain is still convinced that it's there. There's also alien hand syndrome, where an arm goes off on its own, becomes its own entity in a way, and the person feels like it doesn't belong to them anymore. There's split brain patients, where the brain is split in half, and there's effectively two separate personalities involved. This is actually called commissurotomy, where they separate the corpus callosum, the tissue, the white matter that connects the two cerebral hemispheres, and helps them to coordinate each other. And if they're divided, then there is effectively two separate parts of the brain, one part that may believe in God and another part that may not believe in God, one part that may love the person's wife and the other part that may hate her. And they express completely independent thoughts and desires and ideas. So that means that the self is not a singular thing, but it's an aggregate of different processes which can be divided. So generally speaking, there is no such thing as individuality or a self separated from the deterministic system in which we live. There's no getting out of the matrix. There's nothing to get out of the matrix. The matrix is all there is. And I would actually argue that in the dialogue, the dialectic of the matrix between the proponents of determinism and the proponents of free will, it is actually the determinism that wins in the end. If you've seen the film, then you may remember how Trinity, Neo, and Morpheus all believed in free will, and how the Oracle, the Architect, the Merovingian, and all those figures didn't believe in free will, that they understood that the Matrix was a system of control. At some point, Neo escapes the Matrix, and in the second film, he's a second or third film, when Zion falls, he is basically put into a situation to choose to save Zion or choose to save Trinity. And that's when he has the speech with the architect, who says that he doesn't really have a choice, that they've planned this all out. And this is how they fixed the anomaly, was by introducing love, and that Neo will ultimately do what he's supposed to do in order because of love, essentially. And then at some point he ends up returning to the source as well, which is the ultimate goal of the system, really, right? He needs to go back to the source to reboot the system so that it can all start over again. And that's what he does in the end. So that's my interpretation of the film. It's not really that's not really important whether or not the Matrix is right or wrong. But so I may be wrong about that too, and it's not really relevant. But I thought it was interesting because it appeared to me that that's how that film ended, and that's what that film was about. Although it had some pretty cool visual effects too. I think the other thing. So there was a quote up there saying, "We are a way for the universe to become conscious of itself." I believe that was a quote by Carl Sagan, and that is the major point of the issue. In the Bible, it says, um, this is so. There's the story of Pharaoh, which Moses was going to ask to let the Israelites go. God was going to harden his heart so that he wouldn't, and then there was going to be this punishment on Egypt, right, including like all the cattle dying and the firstborn son of every family, and a bunch of other plagues, frogs and locusts and stuff. And all this stuff was going to happen if Pharaoh kept these Israelites in captivity, and God came along and told Moses that he would harden Pharaoh's heart so that he would not listen to Moses and he would not release the Israelites. And when you're talking about free will, is it that everybody has free will except Pharaoh? Pharaoh didn't have free will, and then all these people got punished as a result of his non-free choice. In Isaiah 45:7, I think it is, it says, "I create the light and form the darkness. I create good and I cause evil. I, the Lord, do all these things." And I encourage people to stop thinking about God as a person with some kind of benevolent character, because I don't think that's right at all. Clearly, that verses like that and Romans 9 and the idea that people don't have free will there is kind of negates any concept of this benevolent moral character or human-like character personality to God. I think if God is capable of creating all good and all evil, that makes him something more like the universe or existence as a whole, some kind of creative principle rather than a human being of any kind. And theologically, there's a lot of support for that. The exegesis is there in the biblical text. I don't see how anybody could interpret it otherwise. But millions, if not billions, of people do. So I don't see a conflict there really between Carl Sagan saying we are a way for the universe to experience itself, and for God saying to Pharaoh, "For this reason have I raised thee up, that my wrath may be shown in you." It's effectively a God saying, and forget the part about God speaking. It's God caused, and we can explain why that is, but God caused Pharaoh to harden his heart so that God's wrath would be known. In the same way that the universe makes us conscious so that the universe can experience itself. Because the universe as a whole, when you think in terms of infinity or totality, if you as an individual could see everything that's going on all at once and you could completely predict everything that will happen, your mind would be so saturated that you wouldn't actually be aware of anything. What makes us conscious is our limited ability to focus on a couple of things at a time and to build this kind of crude image of the world where we're not overwhelmed and that there's a focus to consciousness. We might, in our periphery, have certain things that we're aware of, but not fully aware of. And then there's something that is in our focus, right? So if you were the universe aware of all things at all time, you wouldn't be aware of anything at any time. So this kind of limited perception is necessary for anything to exist as as um, as though it existed. And by this, what I mean is that in order for something to have the quality of existence, or the qualia that we associate with existence when we say something appears to exist, is precisely because it appears to exist. If it did not appear to existent to anybody, then it would not actually exist, because it would have no quality of existing. It only has the quality of existing because of the cyclic nature of being an object of subjective experience. Otherwise, the definition of the thing is irrelevant. It doesn't have any visible boundaries because there's nothing viewing it, and therefore it doesn't exist by any sense of what we normally mean by existing. And this is, I think, etymology is not a proof of anything, but it's certainly interesting that in a lot of cases, etymology helps to clarify the meaning of a word. In the case of existence, it comes from an old French word, which literally means to appear, to present an appearance, to have an appearance. And again, etymology is so fascinating when you go into a lot of these concepts, like personality comes from the word persona, which literally means a mask worn in a play, an actor or the character, or something that somebody might make play in a play. In fact, I believe it's a mask worn in like a Roman theater. But what it is, it's like a front to the individual. And when we talk about human personalities, we're talking about some kind of social categorization, some mishmash of different categories and things that don't really have an objective existence, but are more or less practical to our everyday purposes. And it's a mask over top of the complexity of the human brain and the complexity of the universe in general. There's this concept of subreption, which I understand is a legal concept in Roman law, but I understand it as a theological concept of basically taking something which is infinite and therefore beyond comprehension and reducing it to something that is representative of that but does not actually describe it fully, like, so if you can't hold infinity in mind, but we have a symbol of infinity which represents it. The symbol of infinity is not infinity, it just represents infinity. And infinity itself is not something that we can actually hold in mind as a thing, because as soon as we do, we put boundaries around it and it's no longer infinite. So this is this concept of subreption or reduction, reducing a concept that is really complicated into a concept that is not so complicated, but it loses its meaning at the same time. And I think that's what's going on with things like God or existence. We're looking to put there's a Buddhist saying that you can't hold running water in a bucket. If you try to capture some of the stream as it's rushing by, what you create is standing water in the bucket, right? So you can't capture running water in a bucket. And that's basically the same idea, that you can't take something which is infinite and reduce it to an idol or a symbol of some type. And yet that's kind of what people have done, so as to miss the point. And that's the whole concept of idolatry, really, is the idea of putting something else in place of God as an image. So, like, here's Neil deGrasse Tyson saying that the universe is in us and we are in the universe, and there's that duality. It's actually a non-duality, and that's, of course, a Hindu concept, a Jain concept, Hegel's concept, that whenever we see a duality, it's part of some domain in which it is actually non-dual, and we're just prone to thinking in black and white, but we don't see all the shades in between, and we tend to arbitrarily decide which shades are black and which shades are white. And so it is with us and the universe. We see ourselves as some kind of separate being from the universe. Meanwhile, that's not really the case. That's just how we experience ourselves. So this is a common theme. William James is considered to be one of the fathers of modern psychology. And again, what we're seeing is that the idea of an individual self that sits in behind the brain that runs the show as some kind of free agent is just an absurd idea, and it actually robs us of a deeper understanding. This is a point I was making, is that people would say things, well, like you can't have punishment. Well, no, you can. Punishment actually makes sense when you have determinism. It doesn't make sense when you have free will, because with free will, it's presumed that nothing external is going to actually influence the outcome. Or if it does, like there's still a compatibilist component or whatever, right? That part of it doesn't really make sense. That's just kind of shoehorned in there, but that's always the case, right? We give rational explanations for our behavior. If you say, why didn't you wake up to your alarm? Ask your teenager, why didn't you wake up to your alarm? And he's going to give you some excuse, right? I mean, we say it's an excuse, and that there are no excuses. But in fact, he might be telling you the truth, that he just stayed up too late and played video games. Well, that's no excuse. Yeah, okay, but it's a reason, right? It does explain why he didn't wake up. Um, but it's not a reason not to hold him accountable. So the accountability has to be there to prevent future recurrences of that behavior, right? To teach proper behavior, or whatever, right? And that's all determinism. Like the free will part of it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. And again, this is in Buddhism, they talk about the self being an aggregate. One of the main concepts is anatta, which is the concept of no self. And I picked this quote because I really think it's important that what he's saying here about destroying the delight in existence. What I find with a lot of times with people in the free will debate is that they feel like something important is going to be lost, that they're losing something important. The delight in existence, really, right? The the benefit that they feel emotionally from believing in this concept, that they are the doer, that they are worthy of praise, and that other people are worthy of blame accordingly. And this is actually something in psychology called the fundamental attribution error, which is an observed discrepancy between the way that people attribute causality to behavior. If you take the same person and praise them for something, they are more likely to associate it with their own will than anything else. They will just say, "Yeah, well, I did it because I wanted to, because I willed it, and because of me." And on the other hand, if you blame somebody for something, then they externalize the cause. And by externalize, I don't mean they necessarily blame the environment, but they might blame their own brain for doing it. Either way, what they're giving is a causal explanation. They might say, like, I was feeling tired, I didn't understand, I didn't have all the facts, or um, somebody annoyed me that day, I was just having a bad day, I was sick, a whole bunch of other different reasons that person might give, and all of them might be somewhat true. They might be part of the reason why. Often in our moments of despair, I think, is when it becomes the most clear, because in moments of despair, we're searching inwardly for the answers. We're coming up with theories. We're trying to explain why we are the way we are to ourselves, and why things are happening to us the way that they are. And that's also the period of the most self-discovery, usually, which then leads to some kind of epiphany or enlightenment going forward, that then you're better able to cope with reality because you've figured things out more. And that's where, like, understanding is key. Understanding why you are the way that you are, understanding why other people are the way that they are, is key to progress. It's key to self-improvement, and to actually rehabilitating people who do commit crimes and things. That being, the distinction between retributive justice, which is we're punishing you because we get some kind of um, egotistical satisfaction out of punishing you for being an evildoer, versus restorative justice, which is based on what can we do to help address the decisions being made or the limitations on that person's ability to self inhibit or whatever, right? That part of it is a thing, and this may be maybe something nobody's ever considered, but the fact that we are able to inhibit our impulses is a feature of our brains. When we are children, like when we're newborns, we have various impulses or reflexes that we can't inhibit, we can't control them. One of them is the grasp reflex. If you put your finger in the palm of a newborn's hand, they have no choice but to grab your finger. They can't inhibit the impulse. It just happens. And they do a similar thing with their feet. They have, suckling reflex or behavior that they do for breastfeeding and stuff. So there's a number of things there that the brain develops an inhibitory network in the frontal lobe to be able to inhibit those reflexes. And these reflexes can come back if there's damage to the frontal lobe. They're called frontal release signs. And I would encourage people to actually look that up and read about it because it's fascinating. The idea that when we choose not to do something that we want to do, that there is a neurological component to that. In fact, there's a neurological component to everything that we think and do. So that part is not really a surprise, but maybe the whole thing is a surprise to people who don't think about it that way. But there are case examples of that too, where people suffer frontal lobe damage and then they become less inhibited. Classically, Phineas P. Gage is one of those cases. He took a tamping iron through the skull and then became more gregarious and proud and things that his character changed and he wasn't like he was before. And there's another case of an individual that was compulsively abusive towards women, um, flirting with them all the time, coming onto them, assaulting them. And it turned out that he had a tumor in his brain that basically short circuited his ability to inhibit those impulses. And he just acted out an animalistic desire. And I would say you can't really blame the guy because without the brain, the ability to use the brain in that way, then what do you expect from somebody? I mean, obviously the behavior is horrific and it shouldn't have happened, and those people need to be protected from this individual. If this guy is not going to be able to control himself, then we need to find another solution to his being, right? I mean, perhaps execution is the solution. I don't think that's necessary, but I think you could potentially isolate or at least monitor somebody and be able to step in and prevent them from doing it. Actually, another great example like that we do deal with effectively is Prater-Willi Syndrome, in which there's a problem between the stomach producing the hormone ghrelin and the brain interpreting it as a hunger signal. And what happens with people with PWS is they are compulsively hungry and they will overeat and eventually cause damage to themselves and potentially kill themselves by overeating because they can't control the impulse to eat and they feel hungry all the time, even when they're not supposed to be. So there's a problem with self control there. And the way to treat that is to basically restrict their access to food, make it so that they can't get food unless it's given to them. And that's the only way you can help those people. Otherwise, they're not going to be around very long. So that's another great example of how you can deal with these things, right? The guy who has the brain tumor, who has the brain damage where he can't control his sexual impulses anymore. You need to restrict his access to sex, basically. You need to, if he can't control it, you need to make sure that he's not in a position where his lack of self control is going to hurt somebody. That's it. And you don't have to hate the person, right? You just have to recognize that there's something wrong with them. Now there's this whole thing of people actually ruminating on ideas. There is the problem of people convincing themselves that they're not going to get caught and things like that. There's a pretty deep analysis there. One of the, this part here about praise or blame, I think is important because these are two determining factors on behavior. Whether or not a person is being praised or whether or not they are being blamed for something is highly deterministic on their behavior. People do things all the time just to see the smile on a loved one's face. They do things all the time to avoid the shame that they might get from their social groups or something. These are hugely deterministic influences on people's behavior, and oftentimes it drives people to basically a group think, crowd behavior that's completely irrational simply because they're getting praise for it from within the group, and then they're getting shamed if they're not doing it. So this drives people into basically insanity because they're being influenced by these forces. And that's really the nature of psychology. Is we construct a self-image that we put out there in order to ingratiate into a group. Generally, there's some type of uniqueness involved too. So, optimal distinctiveness theory is we want to belong to a group, but we want to stand out within that group somehow. So we have the dual sense of belonging and also of being unique. And we gauge that by praise and blame. Basically, we gauge that by the feedback we get from within the group, right? If people accept the image we put forward, then okay, then we're solidified in that identity in the group. If they reject it, if they post blame or shame or something on us, then we don't, we don't feel like we have that connection to the group. So people want to be part of a group, then these are important considerations. I do want to point out too, Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy follows Dante and Virgil through the layers of hell and purgatory. And at some point, after seeing all of the reasons, all of the causes for why people go astray, he comes to the gates of paradise, and he is basically crowned free over himself. And this is where people might get the idea of a free will, an objective form of free will, in the sense that if you are able to recognize, understand, and overcome the influences on your behavior, if you're actually able to accept that you are part of a deterministic system, and then you're able to understand the determinism behind it, and for that reason you choose to act differently, then that's as close as you're going to ever get to free will. But the more to it than that, the irony is it's not really free. It's just that it's more in tune with what is godly or holy. It's having purified the self, it becomes free of these other determining factors that like praise and blame, and so it's now in tune with God's will or something. I don't want to go too far into that. Again, here's the Bhagavad Gita talking about how a person in the divine consciousness realizes that they don't do anything. There's another section of the Gita where it says, God is with you at all times, using you as a mere instrument. So again, if anybody gets the idea that free will comes from religion, I think they're wrong about that. Avicenna was a famous Arab philosopher. Ibn Sina is another name for him. And this is what he had to say: a thing is not known unless it's known by its causes, which is exactly the criteria of knowledge that I think about. If you know something, then you know it because you understand how it connects to everything else. You can't, if you know something that bears no connection to anything else, then I wouldn't say you really have an understanding of it at all. Understanding implies that you see how it is basically embedded into the world, how important it is. And I think I've said pretty much everything I want to say. I mean, I could talk about this subject for hours and hours, days even, because I see it as such an important thing. Um, not just for people to understand, like, theologically, if they think they know something about theology, because even if you don't believe in God, you still have some kind of idea of what God is and of what the whole religion thing is about. So I think it's important to present a different a different notion of that could challenge some people to maybe go and read some stuff, like I mentioned. Forget about what the majority, the masses think, or even some particular individuals. Like, none of these quotes or any of these people are authoritative in the sense that it's true just because they said it, but more or less, the reason I'm presenting it here is to show that from a scientific point of view, there is it's not an unnovel or an unusual point of view that everything is deterministic and there's no such thing as free will, and nor is that alien to religion, and that's kind of drawn out in the examples and stuff that I've given. Um, Also, American Transcendentalism, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, amazing authors, amazing philosophers, understood quite well the connection of human beings to nature, and the concept of American Transcendentalism was so important to early American life, and it seems to have unfortunately been forgotten or co opted by American consumerism. And now what we consider to be individuality is having a shirt that nobody else has, or having a unique hairstyle, or something like that. Whereas in the view of Emerson and Thoreau, it was more about dissociating from societal influences that shaped our perspective through conformity and stuff like that. So, going beyond praise and blame, and to analyze or understand nature objectively, and not simply be part of the herd and think like everybody else, and have this need to fit in and stand out and from the herd, right? It's more or less just you and nature and figuring out what's true. And again, this quote from Emerson describes what I've been saying. The Theologica Germanica is another theological book, specifically a Christian theology about the nature of God, and it frequently talks about how human beings are in part, or imperfect and in part, and God is perfect and whole. So as to draw out this perspective that there is an ontological difference between a thing, or a thing formed, and God, or the thing that forms. Sorry, the thing in which things are formed, the basis of form. Um, the Theologia Germanica is a great read for understanding this perspective. Another interesting book on that is The Builder and the Plan by Ursula Gestefeld. The Theologia Germanica has an unknown author. It's not clear who wrote it. Doesn't really matter. Again, I would definitely recommend this over The Builder and the Plan, since The Builder and the Plan is like Christian science. It doesn't. I don't think it goes far enough into into the explanation. I don't know if Ursula, the author, um, it's been a while since I read it, but it also talks about this idea that of being a part of the whole, and the difference between being a part and being a whole. So it's very interesting Christian perspective on theology. Shabbastari was Zoroastrian. I definitely recommend reading the Gulshan Iraz, which is the Secret Rose Garden. Translates to the Secret Rose Garden, in which this statement is very similar to the statement made by Martin Luther in The Bondage of the Will. The idea that the illusion of free will is really the Antichrist. The illusion of being an individual is the Antichrist. That it is the opposite of understanding, the opposite of knowledge, and that it creates a delusion that ends in human suffering. And I think this is a difficult concept for people who kind of naively believe in free will to grasp. But when you initially give up on the idea and you start thinking more about determinism and what that implies, it is mortifying in a sense that you lose sense of what's meaningful. You lose sense of um, any purpose for being. It seems like it's all trashed, and you can't imagine what it would be like otherwise. And so the argument often goes like, well, if everything was determined, then we couldn't punish people. We couldn't have hope. We couldn't do this. There's no point to being. What's the point in doing anything? I'll just lay down and die. And I think it's quite the contrary. I think that's an illusion created by that naive belief, and that when you finally are able to remove yourself from it and look at it objectively, you'll come to find that that belief in free will and individuality in that sense is actually is the real horror in life. And this is given in the criminal law. I've pointed this out before in R. v. Ruzick, the Supreme Court of Canada determined that without the free will, of rational mind and knowing right and wrong, blah blah blah, the stigma and punishment of criminal liability would be a gross human rights violation, and would basically mean that the punishment, and particularly the stigma and retributive punishment that we put on criminals, is the worst human rights violation in the modern world. And so to accept that conclusion is horrifying, right? But I think, they said they couldn't imagine any other system of accountability in which people didn't have free will. And I think that's nuts, right? It's just like I was saying before, if somebody has an inability to control themselves, they need to be put into a situation where they can't do the things that they're not able to control. It's that simple. That would either harm themselves or other people. It's pretty simple. It doesn't take a free will to justify that. You're simply saying that people don't want to be sexually assaulted. Therefore, if somebody's unable to control their sexual impulses and is sexually assaulting people, then they need to be isolated from the targets of their sexual assault, right? And I mean, in that case of the brain tumor, there doesn't seem to be any need for punishment, because the person wasn't making the decision out of ignorance or out of narcissism or something. But even that, I would say that narcissism and that kind of disregard for another person's life, and and kind of self-indulgent behavior, is born out of a misunderstanding of the world, which, when you trace it back, almost goes back to free will and individuality, right? The person is acting that way because they're completely ignorant about themselves. They think they're just acting out of free will. They think it's just a stimulus response type mechanism. Well, they don't even think that, because that would be determinism, right? But they're just purely interested in receiving for their own self, and believing that they're that in this illusory, ambiguous version of reality that they don't really understand. And if they did really understand, they wouldn't be doing those things. So I think in some cases, especially with youth, when you're talking about youth that grow up in an environment which has bad role models and operates on poor understanding, that there's opportunity there to take those youth and provide them with an understanding, help them to develop better skills, better methods of self-regulation, understand themselves better through therapy and stuff, and that those will have significant effects on whether or not they reoffend. And this is proven. Like, when you look at restorative justice programs, the recidivism rates are way lower than they are with retributive punishment. That's just a fact. There, I mean, there's the idea of helping out the community and stuff like that is one thing, like broken windows theory. Um, the idea that if you just pour money and resources into a community, that's going to reduce crime. I think that's wrong. I think that certainly helps to a point. That if people have the resources available to them, they're less likely to commit crimes. But if they're still seeking after self and doing all this crazy stuff, it doesn't matter, right? They're still going to want more. They're still going to do stupid things because they don't understand any of it. So understanding is the key element. And I think with understanding, people can have minimal resources and still be well off, still be mentally wealthy or mentally healthy, and actually develop and grow those opportunities into real financial wealth if they wanted to. But I would also argue that somebody in a state of understanding or a state of awareness doesn't really care that much about money. Money is just a means to an end. There's no reason to accumulate mass amounts of money. There's no reason to go out and buy fancy vehicles or anything like that. That's all just egotism, self-satisfaction, and it's got nothing to do with a connection with a greater sense of belonging or sense of being as a member of the universe. So I think with more pure understanding, these problems simply go away unless the individual has some kind of neurological deficit of some type. This is the part, famous part from Romans 9, often quoted by the Calvinists. Hath not the potter power over the clay of the same lump to make one vessel unto honor and another unto dishonor? And something very similar was stated by Buddha. When you get into the oldest history of religion, it all kind of bleeds together, like the Hellenization period with Rome, the Roman philosophy and the Hebrew philosophy spilling into each other. And in the Hebrew philosophy, we see plenty of references to Egyptian philosophy and Mesopotamian culture. There's stories borrowed from the Epic of Gilgamesh. There's stories borrowed from Hammurabi. There's all kinds of influences there. And I think, the anthropomorphization, when Michelangelo drew the image of God and man on the Sistine Chapel, I think of that's like almost like a Greek influence from the image of Zeus, and just the idea of this anthropomorphization is kind of a poetic way of portraying things. But those kinds of images or idols are what have really confused people. I recently exposed myself to Paradise Lost, and I saw so many parallels between John Milton's poem and what people commonly believe is the nature of heaven and hell. And yet, Paradise Lost is a poem from like the 15th century. It's not scripture, right? So when you go looking for some of that stuff in the scripture, it's just not there, right? It this whole like pantheon of angels doesn't exist in the full capacity with all this drama that it does in Paradise Lost. And so it's important to separate these kinds of artistic things like Dante's Divine Comedy from, which is, Italian poetry. It's not gospel. It's not biblical canon. It's not scripture. It's Italian poetry. So it's supposed to be more dramatic, a more dramatic way, a more anthropological way of portraying things. And in fact, Dante Alighieri says of his work that it's anagogy, which is a Catholic term, which means that it's a pointing at or a rising above. So he said there's four ways to interpret the Divine Comedy. One is literally, one is morally, one is allegorically, literally, allegorically, analogically, and anagogically, and that you have to interpret them in that sequence. So you first interpret the story literally, and then through the literal interpretation, you ascertain the allegorical interpretation or analogical interpretation, which then leads you to the anagogical interpretation, which is generally of a mystic nature or of a higher understanding. So, you take a simple parable or fable like the boy who cried wolf. Boy cries wolf. People believe him. They come running. After a few times, they don't believe him anymore. And he gets eaten by a wolf. And there's a moral to that story, which is not explicitly stated in the story necessarily, but you understand the moral based off of the how the story is told, the different elements of the story, and so forth. So is the biblical stories, and so is Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, and probably many of these other poems. That's what makes it poetry, is that it's not necessarily a direct expletive of or explication of reality, but it's more of dancing around, pointing at, um, indication of, and that's what anagogy is. But up to a higher, more integrative understanding of things, and that's a Catholic concept. So, so it's important to realize that in religion and Catholicism, in even in Reformed Christianity, which is the splintering of Christianity off into the Anabaptists and so on, or Baptists and the Reformed Christians, essentially. The Calvinists too. Who Calvinists don't believe in free will. That's the only one that kind of holds to that point of view. In North America, it seems like as an institution, the Calvinists are the only ones that explicitly reject free will. But I mean, they all should, because it's explicitly rejected in the Bible. Anyways, it's kind of a long video. I hope I covered all the bases that I wanted to cover. I'll probably think of something else afterwards. And hopefully you guys found it interesting and maybe had, found learned some things that you didn't know, or at least some unique ideas, unique ways of thinking about this subject. And yeah, thanks for checking it out.